The prosecution have put in for an extension of that arrest warrant. There's all sorts of very complicated Korean constitutional issues that are impeding that arrest in the next stage in the story.
An arrest warrant for the impeached South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol was due to expire about 15 minutes ago. An attempt to arrest him failed last week when presidential security service guards and protesters blocked the move. So what happens now? The Times' Richard Spencer is following events. Well, that's the key question. What does happen now, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, more arguments among grumpy middle-aged men, I think, is the answer to that. Yes, I mean, there was an impending crisis. Well, it is a crisis, but there was a sort of impending climax with the deadline, which has just passed 22 minutes ago, for the arrest of former President Yoon, well, impeached President Yoon, whatever we call an impeached president. But in fact, that seems to that has sort of gone away slightly because the prosecution have put in for an extension of that arrest warrant. There's all sorts of very complicated Korean constitutional issues that are impeding that arrest in the next stage in the story. You'd have to be a Korean legal expert to really predict what's going to happen next. What is happening is this huge standoff, basically between the forces of the right and the left in South Korea. The left are furious with President Yoon, who is a conservative, quite a hard-line conservative, but very pro-Western. So Britain and America quite like him. But he did try and, as you say, declare martial law to try and overcome opposition from the left-wing controlled parliament to some of his plans. That obviously caused fury, and I think by common consent, including most of his supporters, was a mistake. The question is how harshly he should be punished for that mistake. And there appears to be a split in the establishment in South Korea, the opposition and the Corruption Investigation Authority, which is the organization that levels charges against senior leaders, say he should be prosecuted, but the Presidential Guard has its own constitutional advice, which says that they are going to prevent him being arrested. So that's the standoff.
Right. And when you say standoff, is that likely to become violent, Richard?
Well, it hasn't so far. I mean, this is a very worrying incident because South Korea has been such a sort of poster boy for democratization over the last 4 decades. This dictatorship that had been riven by civil war and this incredible stress of having North Korea as your neighbor, and the demilitarized zone that sort of ended that civil war, still there. Nevertheless, despite this grievous history, becoming a democracy, becoming incredibly prosperous, becoming this key part of the global supply chain, making friends with everyone, really, because it's had very good relations with China for trade, as well as with the West over its political values. For it suddenly to be plunged into this crisis is kind of very upsetting, particularly for older people. So I'd say those middle-aged people and older who can remember growing up in the years of dictatorship when things were pretty grim in many cases. On the other hand, you can look at it as a positive because there hasn't been any major violence. There are these constant attempts to seek constitutional means for both sides to take their cause further, if you like. Even today, the police were handed the brief to arrest the president, and they immediately sought legal advice to see what the constitutional position told them to do, if you like. So in that sense, there are some positives, and yes, no violence yet. I mean, obviously, we hope that continues.
Yeah. The likelihood of an intervention by a foreign power is what? It's interesting to note that the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is in South Korea today.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's very interesting about this story, even if you're not particularly interested in Korean politics, and I guess for most people it's a small country a long way away, but I think it speaks for a bigger story because This is all, this is all happening in the shadow of, if you look at it like that, or in the expectation that a Biden presidency is about to give way to a Donald Trump presidency, and no one really knows what that means. As I say, Yoon is a conservative figure. He grew up in the dictatorship and he's a conservative. So maybe, I mean, this may be pop psychology. Maybe there's a little bit going on there that says, well, I'm president. I should be allowed to do what I say and and impose my electoral mandate on the opposition, even though it has majority in the parliament. And you can see elements of Donald Trump in that coming to power, saying these are all liberal leftists, weak-minded people who want to undermine the security of South Korea or America, which depending which country you're talking about, and wanting to sweep that aside. So. In the meantime, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, is in South Korea today. He's been talking to the acting president. Obviously, he's not going to, sit there and tell the South Korean Constitutional Court what to do. But he has, America has expressed concern at the standoff, and they said that the statement department said they thought that Yoon's declaration of martial law was ill-judged, but then that does seem to be the universal consensus now. They want the Americans want South Korea to maintain Yoon's very sort of pro-Western stance, to join with it in criticizing China over its policies in the Pacific, whereas the left-wing opposition is more conciliatory on that score. So there is a lot of American interest in this, and there's a lot of Western interest, and certainly Britain, which had good relations with South Korea. Yoon made a state visit to Britain just over a year ago. We're also looking at this very closely because of this wider connotation of whether these constitutional ways out of these political crises can be upheld in this world of much greater polarization between right and left and populist politics more generally.
What a crucible of geopolitical rubs. Richard, thank you very much indeed. That's the Times' Richard Spencer. So just to remind you of the important headline there, the arrest warrant for the impeached South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol was due to expire about 25 minutes ago now. It did, and there's a standoff.
Steve has emailed about the NHS. If we consider the reduction in waiting lists to be worth the price we have to pay for some patients to be dealt with by the private sector, then that money is well spent. The way to treat more patients is to have more doctors and nurses and more facilities, but they can't be conjured up by next Wednesday. So sometimes we just got to deal with what we can. According to almost all of the polls, the NHS is the highest priority for most people. I assume reduction in waiting lists is one of the improvements most people would like to see. I think I made a bit of a Horlicks of the first sentence there, Steve, but I hope the message is essentially true.